Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is the first of what I hope will be a series of conversations with guests around issues, all issues, Catullan. So I'm calling it Catullan Conversations. And today I'm very generously joined by Dr. Toph Marshall to talk about Catullus 51 and Sappho 31. So Toph, can you just tell us a little something about yourself?
Sure. My name is Toph Marshall. Most of my work is on Greek and Roman theater and stagecraft conventions, but I love Greek poetry, and I'm very happy to represent the Sappho side of this Catullan conversation. I teach at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver.
Thank you very much. And I'm at Bard High School, early college in Cleveland, and I guess I'm here to represent the Catullan side of things. The way this conversation is going to go is we'll start by talking about Catullus 51, and then we'll talk about Sappho 31, and then we'll put them into conversation. So we begin with Catullus 51 using the translation by Peter Green, 51. In my eyes, he seems like a god's co-equal. He, if I dare say so, eclipses Godhead, who now face to face, uninterrupted, watches and hears you, sweetly laughing. That sunders unhappy me from all my senses. The instant I catch sight of you now, Lesbia, dumbness grips my voice. It dies on my vocal cords. My tongue goes torpid. And through my body, thin fire lances down. My ears are ringing with their own thunder, while night curtains both my eyes into darkness. Leisure, Catullus, is dangerous to you. Leisure urges you into extravagant behavior. Leisure, in time gone by, has ruined kings and prosperous cities. So maybe even before we begin, where do you come down, Toph, on the biographical tradition of Catullus? Do you think that when he's talking about himself, naming himself, there's a person behind that?
I think the feelings that he's describing are certainly things that he identifies with, whether he's fictionalizing the situation or not. What we're seeing is true emotion and not just the pretense of emotion. And certainly I understand jealousy. I understand glaring across the room at the guy talking to somebody I have a crush on. I'll say that lives with a vivid memory, even decades later.
And that's a really great point, because it's easy to identify with the Catullan emotion. People have been, as you described, at this intimate gathering, semi-public gathering, experiencing this moment. So let's start then just with this first stanza. In my eyes, he seems like a god's co-equal. He, if I dare say so, eclipses Godhead, who now face to face, uninterrupted, watches and hears you, enjambment, sweetly laughing.
It's wonderful because whoever the he is, his Godhead is completely dependent on the fact that he's close to the you, and he's close to he's making you laugh, making you smile, and that's what makes him godlike in our observer's eyes.
There's something really extraordinary here about pronouns and like the intimacy, but also the distance that a pronoun carries with it. That anaphoric illa there in the Latin is really, really striking because it's a deictic as well. It's like you can point to who this person is, and like in the Catullan imagination, but then also in ours. But I love that first line because at this point, my personal take on Catullus is less interested in trying to reconstruct the order that the poems originally went in, and rather more what had the greatest influence on the history of receiving the Catullan corpus, and that is to have them in the order we have them in. And right. At this point then, with 51, you've had several of the homoerotic poems, and that first line could easily be, Illa, that man, is equal, like, I love him. I view him as a god, like this kind of pickup line to a male addressee, which I think it's a good twist that happens here.
Quickly grabbing my text because I want to make sure that I'm not mistaken, but we've got certainly the emphasis on odium in the previous poem is also going to be relevant.
Yes.
So you're exactly right that the sequencing shapes the reading that we have, and we do have odium and a male addressee in poem 50, and I think that's relevant.
Absolutely. And so something else that I'm interested in with Catullus is that the bridge between the erotic sphere and the political sphere and the religious sphere. And I think we have that right away. Like the provocation of saying somebody seems similar to a god in a culture in which your political leaders are vying for relation to gods in a lot of ways, descent from gods. That charged religious language of si fas est, like if it's kind of morally, religiously right. I'm not going to rag too much on translation, but like if I dare say so, I guess that idea of like daring, going against some larger purpose is present. And then,
And
yeah,
certainly to say that someone is superare dios, is surpassing the gods, is never fast. That's not a right thing to say, and Catullus certainly knows that.
Yeah, and that hit nails on the beautiful throughout this poem, the sharp juxtapositions that he'll do. We're going to see it again in the next stanza. And superare, I think, is also interesting because of, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we're going to talk about kings at the end. And the last Roman king was Tarquinius Superbus. And so anytime, like I think we're building up in that just first sentence, everything that's here. I wonder, because of your interest in the theater, if you see anything theatrical in these last two lines about somebody sitting and watching and hearing other people.
That's interesting, because for me, I'll say if we're the one who's doing the sitting is on stage. The one who's doing the sitting is one of the actors in this show. It's Catullus or speaker who is the audience for it. And so I'll say my reading is that this is like an eavesdropping scene. He's playing the lover who's being excluded, who's not part of the fun, but really wants to be part of the fun. And so, yeah, no, I think that's the angle I would take if we were to put a theatrical metaphor onto it.
I love it. So we sharply and jam into the second stanza. You sweetly laughing, that sunders unhappy me from all my senses. The instant I catch sight of you now, Lesbia, dumbness grips my voice. It dies on my vocal cords. And then maybe just for some of the viewers, the reason why we have these angled brackets here is because this is a supplementation to the text. That's what's happening there, just for your awareness.
And we know that we need those extra syllables because of the shape of the stanza that's being used.
So when we come to this one, what's the first thing that kind of stands out to you, or what do you hear, maybe is a better way in this poem to ask?
Well, maybe the force of the first word in line 6, ripet, that word that's being translated as sundered, marking the gulf that exists between this couple that he's watching and him watching them. It's a weird way to begin a love poem, when the beloved is in conversation with somebody who's charming and at least making her laugh or making her pretend to laugh. We've the intimacy that the speaker wants is being shown to him, and Ripet really marks that division, I think, between the observer and the observed.
Yeah, I also am struck by that verb, especially because looking at the anaphoric opening of the previous stanza with the illa and the qui and the spectat, nothing's really standing out there. But then you have like dulce, but then eripit. Like we're out of this lull there when we hit that enjambment to the verb. And of course, there's also a verb of like snatching something away and dismembering, which is what a conqueror does. Like this is language of imperial conquest that happening at the sensory level. Like instead of having your body torn apart or your riches taken away, like that which is inextricably the person has been grabbed. And it comes so strikingly, I'm struck with this kind of like, I don't know. I was trying to remember what this word is when you end a word with the letter that the next one begins with. Some kind of like anadiplosis with alliteration, but I couldn't remember what it was. But that M sound transitions from the laughter straight to the misero. Right? In terms of those sharp juxtapositions that we had above that you were pointing out. And I think there's something neat with Catullus, like with a lot of poets, he kind of teaches you how to read his poem. And so he's talked about being face to face at Versus earlier. And so looking, I think, through the poem at things that are next to each other, kind of an invitation. So I catch sight of you, Lesbia. We should say this name at this point is very important. Whether or not you have read any other Catullus, the fact of the meter, as Toph mentioned, is in Sapphics, this meter that Sappho from Lesbos wrote in, and then the name Lesbia being a reference to the island of Lesbos where Sappho lived. But I wonder if there's anything else happening that you, or what you think about even the pseudonym of Lesbia.
I think it's really easy to over speculate on the pseudonym of Lesbia. There have been a good number of Lesbia poems already in the collection, and Lesbia has been present throughout. Whether Lesbia points to a real person or not isn't my focus when I'm reading these questions, but certainly, or reading these poems, but certainly I think there is the implication of love poetry in the past, Greek love poetry, that Catullus is adopting a voice from Greek literature that really hasn't been brought into the Roman ambit yet. And he is claiming that for himself.
So an idea that I had earlier today as I was looking at this, and I want to run it by you, is that this is also not a marker of the biographical so much as like the metapoetic. And he's talking about the scroll reading the poems. So like, then it would be the second I catch sight of you, Sappho poetry, then I'm struck dumb. Then I can't create anymore because I'm blown away by how good Sappho you were. And then that first stanza then becomes somebody else that's reading. It's almost that moment when Augustine is jealous of somebody else getting to hear the words from being read. And he's like, oh, I want to hear that too. And so here we have almost like Catullus being like, I love reading Sappho, and now I'm watching somebody else reading Sappho.
Yeah, I think though that we have to see that the Lesbia is the te, which is the previous word, and the te that had been at a line end in line 3 as well. That the person he's addressing is this woman, and maybe that's too mundane, but I think that we want to keep that level active. We're not putting aside the interpersonal situation in order to introduce the metapoetic one.
Thank you for that. I'm looking forward to you continuing to push against my metapoetics. So then my tongue goes torpid, and through my body thin fire lances down. My ears are ringing with their own thunder, while night curtains both my eyes into darkness. And we come to our first full stop. Is there anything here beyond kind of typical language of burning in love that you see?
You know, I think it's more than typical here. Like it's become typical for us because this poem exists and because this poem is known. But he's describing those conflicting emotions that I'll say, that ring through our bodies, that are contradictory just in themselves. We're cold, we're hot. The things that love songs today and pop culture regularly foist on us. But here we're, he can't speak. He's feeling hot. It's not bells are ringing, but thunder is ringing in his ears. So he's not even hearing what it is. He's so, if this were being filmed for us, all of a sudden the camera lens gets blurry. There's static hearing so that we no longer hear the details of the speech. I think I hope that's something we can all identify with, even though it's horrible when it's happening to us.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the Flama de Monnat. So Green has translated this as lances down, but this is a word of flowing. And so again, we have like a paradoxical juxtaposition with like fire.
Flame pours down, yeah.
Yeah, that fire and water, which, and I guess that's in a sense like, what's happening. I hear kind of because of that language of religion with si faces, and then this sound that's suddenly ringing. It's portentous. Like this is almost like something a greater power is present at this moment.
Absolutely.
And especially like we have, it might be tempted in the English. There's a really great thing that I think that Green is doing where he has eclipse in the second line, and then he describes this sudden eclipse that's happening. That's not happening in the Latin, but it's a moment when I think a translation can do its own thing almost to render itself poetic.
Yeah.
And then we come to the famous fourth stanza.
Why is it famous?
It's famous because of something we're going to talk about in a little bit around Catullus breaking away from the Sapphic model. Leisure, Catullus, is dangerous to you. Leisure urges you into extravagant behavior. Leisure, in time gone by, has ruined kings and prosperous cities. So I guess just like in terms of maybe composition, we return at this point with that anaphoric repetition of otium to the opening strategy of ille, which just kind of, it's a form of Catullan elegance almost in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Ille and qui are all referring to the same person. Odium, odio, and odium are all referring to the same leisure.
Yeah, and then with that that first verb in those fourth lines of those stanzas, like being a spectator versus the like destruction that you go through. And throughout this whole poem, one thing you could do is you could actually run an argument that this poem moves from spectat to perdebit in terms of like what's happened to the Catullan body through it. So what are your initial, or what are some thoughts you have here about this fourth stanza? Just start broad.
Well, there is a Sapphic model for this poem, and this stanza isn't in the Sapphic model. And so I don't know if my thoughts are necessarily particularly original ones, but certainly the introduction of leisure marks Catullus's situation as being slightly different than the poem that he is presenting for us. If we know the Sappho poem, we're seeing a change here. And the change, by focusing on having free time, I think our spectator hasn't had free time, is the act of translation of a Sapphic poem in order to represent whatever he's experiencing, or whatever he wants to represent. Is that when the leisure happens? Is it, to play into your MetaPoetic interpretation, you could see that as being one of the points of connection. But I'm going to say again, if the emotions that resonate with me and my own past, it's what you brood on as a young person when your crush isn't reciprocated, or when you imagine your crush isn't reciprocated. And it isn't leisure time when you're on your own. In fact, that's where you brood and start listening to sad music from the 90s that might share the coloring that you feel inside your heart, where you want the whole world to resonate with the passions that you are feeling. Why aren't the clouds gray? When I feel so sad, why do the birds keep on singing, as the old song goes? And so I think that might be part of the odium that Catullus is feeling here. He's no longer in that jealousy, eavesdropping situation, but he's now removed from it. But even being removed from it doesn't take him away from the emotions that he was feeling. And it maybe even intensifies him. He can focus on his lovelornness or his feigned lovelornness.
I wonder if I heard you correctly when you started there, which is one thing you might have been saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, or we'll build out of it, that Catullus is in leisure kind of translating, and then he realizes, oh, translating this is bad for me. Like, me not doing something else, I am now even more depressed because like I used my leisure time for translation.
Or I use my leisure time, if I'm not going to write my own poetry, to represent Sappho's poetry to reflect the emotional state that I'm feeling. I guess I do impute some biographical motive to it, even if it's an artificially constructed one. I am going to write a sad poem now.
I also, so
as
I see,
Morrissey said, every day of his life. It's
I also see something kind of fun with the triple repetition of otium, because it's like an energetic repetition. Like it's, so it's not like, it's not leisurely. And then he's also like exultas, this like there's odd verbs of energy in this stanza. Oh, that's all about having too much leisure, which is really delightful play. And then just to bring us back, I think, to this idea of the politics being in the erotic, the last two lines, it's very difficult to get beyond this. Leisure in time gone by has ruined kings, reges prius, and prosperous cities, beatas urbes. So I earlier tried to make a connection between superare and the like Tarquin superbus, Tarquin the proud, and the whole story right about the end of the Tarquins is one of maybe taking advantage of an erotic situation. So I don't know, this might be, again, be me reading too much into this moment, but I see him making these connections, but I'm just curious what you have.
I would observe that the emphasis on odium allows you to read into it. The very fact that it is a representation of a poem, that what he's adding to the Greek poem is odium. He's encouraging us to look at how far apart me and Te are in the first stanza and see them getting closer in line 6 with me, he, and Te separated only by a couple of words, and then start looking for me and Te in that third stanza and not finding them, just finding all the biological things happening inside me. The Te is even gone at this point. He's gone from trying to get closer and closer to Lesbia to just focusing on himself in maybe a self-indulgent way, but in a way that otium has allowed him to do. So I think we can keep all those readings afloat, and the emphasis on otium perhaps encourages that.
And I think as well, like, however we take otium, whether it's leisure time on your own, or where is he seeing this first stanza? Is this at a dinner party? Is this at somewhere else? That's a moment of leisure that you have. Like, even being invited to a party, if he's going to see Lesbian in this situation, that's going to destroy him. Like, it's like a great poem of complaining about being rich. Like, oh, my
there's an awful lot of privilege going on in Catullus's poem here.
Okay, so, and then my last kind of moment of thinking about the MetaPoetic, you mentioned already, but 50 is Catullus kind of writing this poem back and forth in freedom. And so that's partly you're able to do that writing activity. And here, leisure gives Catullus time to write, to translate, as you're saying, to think and to read. And then I love that how you said it. Leisure, we as readers also have leisure, and then we have leisure to overthink or to identify.
And if we're sitting and reading Catullus poems, again, we're sitting in a position of privilege that allows us the time to do so.
Indeed. With that, we're going to turn to Sappho 31, and I wonder if you can do the reading, please.
Sure. This is Anne Carson's translation.
Yes.
He seems to me equal to gods, that man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking and lovely laughing. Oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings, for when I look at you, even a moment, no speaking is left in me, no tongue breaks, and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears, and cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me all. Greener than grass I am, and dead, or almost, I seem to me. But all is to be dared, because even a person of poverty.
And then one of the great silences that happens in a poem.
It's not a full sentence. It's
So let's do the same thing that we did before, kind of just treat this as a poem unto itself. And then the next thing we will do is talk about them together. So
certainly we've seen the idea before. This time it's Sappho who's looking at a couple, but we can tell that that the beloved is talking to and speaking and laughing at some guy, the Kanos in the first line there, but that he is isos theoisen, equal to the gods, but he's equal because that man Oner sits opposite you in antioistoi, and he gets to listen to your speaking and your laughing. And again, we go to the internal response as Sappho is trying to, I guess, talk about the physiology of jealousy, or the physiology of being in love, or being in crush with someone.
Yeah, and I love that Hotus, because no matter who this person is, like this is not this is a generalized situation that can happen, and it's almost even more universally applicable. And you might not even know the person, you might not know anything about the situation. I think it renders it, that small level of vagueness renders it, I think, even more potent.
Yeah, that dude sitting opposite you. It's
yeah, like why is he so lucky?
Yeah,
as opposed to so a line that I'm really always interested in is, it puts the heart in my chest on wings. Like it bewings my heart. As I mean, Sappho captures metaphor, I think, just so beautifully here, because she's saying, oh, my heart starts beating faster.
Yeah.
But it's also carrying with it then all of the metaphors of birds and of freedom, of the sky, your idea of turning the internal external, but then it's also caged in a way. Like,
and the thought of her heart flying out towards the beloved, like Homer's winged words or whatever.
Yep.
That's what could be happening or should be happening. And it's at this point you'll remember that Catullus introduces the gulf, where he's separating the eavesdroppers from the eavesdropped. She has her heart reaching out. And I think that's a nice contrast that Catullus introduced.
Definitely in both of these poems, we have people that are dropping the eaves.
Yeah.
A Tolkien reference there. I am so into your connection to the winged words. This idea that like a poem is not winged words, because it's not this oral thing that you are putting out, but instead, like almost, I know there's ideas about like the orality of Sappho versus the writtenness of Sappho, but like the act of writing versus oral performance, I think is beautifully captures kind of what you're saying.
Well, I think we know that these poems were originally performed, that we're the biographical tradition, not that we trust it, but what it assumes is that she is making innovations on the lyre. We call this lyric poetry. This is meant to be sung, and these short stanzas are meant to be sung in symphotic contexts. And so against the writtenness of Catullus, we've got this lyric performative context, perhaps, of Sappho, where she could be the musician. She could be singing to the attractive woman on the couch who's distracted by the good-looking fella next to him, next to her.
And even then, the nice thing about metaphors is you can make them do whatever you want, because heart in my chest on wings could be like putting words to a lyre, where then when they float out through that
Exactly.
musical resonance.
No, I like that.
And then, of course, then there's no speaking left in her, but she has singing.
Or it's that deliberate paradox that poets often present, where if you want me to shut up, I'll shut up, but they're continuing to talk even though they say they've got nothing to say.
In which case, I think there's an unlikely but a compelling reading of breaking off at the end of this poem, because that's the best way to kind of convey the actual act of a tongue break. Or
that would be lovely, but I don't believe it.
Nope. But in terms of the reception of this poem and the history of it, that's tongue breaks and thin fire is racing under the skin. We're going to talk about that in a second. In eyes no sight, and drumming fills the ears. And then, so where Catullus plays with otium, we have this extraordinary stanza by Sappho, and I'm hoping that you will talk about this a bit. And cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me all. Greener than grass I am, and dead, or almost, I seem to me.
Yeah. So I think we can maybe work backwards if we want to. And if we start with the last line, the I seem to me, that's picking up on the first line. And he seems to me, I seem to me, sort of bookends this thought. And how we get to that is through some bits that Catullus doesn't include in his physiognomics of the crush. And so we focus on sweat, shivers. So this is the language of being very sick. We talk about being lovesick, but this isn't love sickness. This is love vomiting, or this is love. I want something stronger. She's completely her focus on the physiological response becomes all-consuming and is intensifying here. So she's shaking, she's sweating, she's gone pale. That's generally the way people take the greener than grass, though we can talk about that. And I am dead, but she's not dead. She's almost dead. So is she, it's not that she's being hypochondriacal here, but the physiological effect of her emotions is overcoming her, but it's not taking her to a point of death, which would end it. So there's this sense that it continues. So we have sort of three thoughts in those last two lines: to be dead, to be almost dead, to seem to be almost dead. And each of those backs away a little bit from the extreme response to her emotions that she's been describing, and describing passionately and powerfully, as maybe she comes to her senses.
Yeah. And in that case, it's like therapeutic poetry, where you write yourself into a place of recovery and awareness. Like almost with that last, I seem to me, you've like removed yourself from the situation, and it's like you can see, oh, okay, that's what was happening. I've like shifted out of that mode of the personal to now being self-aware of myself as an entity.
Yeah. And so in saying that, I guess I'm making the case that this is the complete poem, that we've got 16 lines, and that that's the complete thought, and that even though "but all is to be dared" sounds like a great next line for this poem, I suspect likely it was just the next poem in the scroll, and it's being taken in as part of this extended fragment. I would like it if suddenly at the last moment, as she comes to her senses, she goes, no, casts aside that common sense and launches herself towards her beloved so that she can, confess all or break up the intimacy of the laughing and the sweet speaking. But I don't think that's what the poem's doing.
Right. And I think that ring composition that you discussed of the finita to the phinomy, like
it sells that.
You're gonna lose an emphatic repetition if you keep going.
That's true. There's a weird tradition about that first line too, and this is something that I've not fully thought through and fully looked through, but as I think it's on our next slide here, there is another fragment of Sappho, which is "Phinatai voi kainos" instead of "Phinatai moi kainos." That man seems to himself rather than to me. We can go back just to see those first three words. The fact that we've got those lines, if they belong to a different poem, it would obviously be a counterpoint to this poem. It would, but I think almost certainly that it comes from it's a quotation from, if memory serves, a book on funny uses of pronouns, and so it's even calling attention. The passage was saved because of that "voi," but I don't think necessarily we have to assume that there was another poem that did this. And I'll say the fact that we have Catullus presenting it with me being the observer rather than this guy observing himself suggests that what we're reading here in fragment 31 is in fact the primary reading. That this is what, even though it's the more common pronoun, it's the right one, or it's the one that certainly had reached Catullus.
And so that might be a great opportunity to come to our last question. What do you think Catullus is doing? Is this translation? Is this adaptation? Is this imitation? Is it a remix? Is it a mixture? Is it something completely different?
For the first three stanzas, I would say he is translating, and he's translating fairly and honestly. He wants to represent the situation that Sappho has described. And he chooses that situation for whatever reason, because it's apt for his purposes. He chooses to represent his thoughts with her words. But when it comes, and in doing so, he adds things like the religious imagery that you have described and the various other things that we've talked about. But when it comes time to that all-consuming physiological response from which Sappho talks herself out, he decides to focus on otium. And that builds a connection. If we believe that the poems are authorially ordered, which many do, it builds a connection with the previous poem. It also reflects on his situation, the fact that it's his poem only affects to be sung verse. It's a written thing. He's got leisure, we've got leisure. And that allows for the more, I'll say, self-indulgent examination of feelings, in a good way, but it takes it in a different direction. So at that point, he is remixing it, I would say. He wants us to think one thing is happening. He wants us to know the original, and he wants us to notice when he departs and goes askew.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really important point to emphasize, this idea of wanting us to know. You could begin just with that first line of "in my eyes he seems," and it would be recognizable to an elite audience perhaps, but then he kind of widens it and keeps widening it, so you can't escape it, I don't think. One thing that I'll add that I was thinking about as you were talking in terms of what it does and that shift in those 4 stanzas is when Sappho gets kind of the most personal introspective, Catullus gets the most kind of external and outward. And I was now looking at these things, thinking about ruined kings and prosperous cities. The act of translating Sappho actually makes sure that she's not ruined. She's not a king or a city, because he's like given her a new life. So similar to how he hopes in his opening poem, I hope I last one more generation, uno cyclo. Here, Catullus has ensured that Sappho will survive, almost like it's something neat is happening there, thinking about, like, because poems are obviously being set up into contrast to kings and cities, but I think here this like resurrectory movement of Catullus to translate.
That's nice.
Well, I want to thank you very much for stopping by for this inaugural Catullan conversation, Toph. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, what a treat. Thank you so very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about poetry.
And if anybody is interested in talking about a Catullus poem, just get in touch with me.